They said it was punishment, that whoever entered that part of the forest would not return the same if they returned at all. But he had no choice. He was thrown there by hands that claimed to be just but carried fear. Fear of what he was, or what he could become. The forest greeted him in silence, not with screams, not with monsters, but with what no one can face, themselves. Every root seemed to pull at his mistakes. Every shadow reflected what he tried to bury. And the more he tried to get out, the tighter the forest got. Days passed without voice, without name, without light, until something inside him, not outside, broke. Or rather, it opened. It was there, between the cold of the mist and the pain that could not be screamed, that he understood. The forest did not want to kill him. She wanted him to stop being what the world made him, to become what he always was. No one looked him in the eye when he was left at the edge of the forest. The words of condemnation had been cold, curt, and spoken by those who had never truly understood him. It wasn't an official sentence, but everyone knew. This was exile disguised as justice, a separation camouflaged as security. He was the problem no one wanted to solve, only forget. The forest floor seemed to absorb the sound of his footsteps. There were no echoes. Not even the branches beneath his feet creaked. It was as if everything there silently accepted him, not out of compassion, but out of knowing exactly what he carried. For the first few days, he tried to hold his own. He built a makeshift shelter among the rocks, lit small fires, and ate what he could hunt. But it wasn't the cold that was crushing him, nor hunger. It was the silence, the absence of any human presence, the loneliness that screams without making a sound. During the nights, he didn't sleep. His eyes were open, alert for any movement among the trunks. And there were many. Silhouettes that crept along the edge of his vision. Glows that resembled eyes, but never came closer. He didn't know if it was a hallucination or wakefulness. He only knew he was being watched, and that he wasn't welcome. But the scariest thing wasn't what came from outside. That was what was beginning to emerge from within. The following days were different. Time seemed to lose its shape. The light filtering through the treetops no longer indicated morning or afternoon. Everything became an extension of the same moment, a repeated cycle of waiting and memory. And it was. Then, that the memories began to hurt more than his body. There were no distractions, no voices to distract him from his own. And they spoke. They whispered everything he had tried to silence for years. He remembered the first time he lied to himself, the first time he'd agreed to remain silent out of fear, the last time he'd looked in the mirror and not recognized who he was. The forest said nothing, but every tree seemed to see him, and every root seemed to whisper, "Now it's just you, and what's left." The fever came on the third night. It burned like fire inside, and in that state, between reality and delirium, he heard a sound, not a roar, not a call. It was a distant howl, long, trembling, filled with pain and suppressed fury. He didn't know if the sound came from outside or inside, but in that moment, something began to change. Exile was no longer a punishment. It was the beginning of a transformation. He woke from a dreamless sleep, or maybe he just passed out. His body was drenched in sweat, even in the forest chill. His hands were shaking, his eyes bleary. He didn't know how long it had been since he'd fallen, but he knew he wasn't the same as before. The ground where he lay seemed harder, heavier. The earth around him wasn't just soil, it was presence. It pressed, judged, demanded. Every speck of dust seemed to contain ancient memories, and every breath he took, he felt as if he were inhaling echoes of something he didn't understand. The pain came from within, but it wasn't just physical. It was a dense emotional ache that crushed his chest, as if the forest itself were pushing the past back inside him. The images came back with cruel clarity. The faces that betrayed him, the absence of those who promised to stay, the moments he pretended to be someone else just to fit in a place that never accepted him. His body was weak, but there was no visible threat. No lurking animals, no voices. Just the forest and him. He crawled to a fallen trunk trying to find his footing. As he placed his hand on the wood, he felt a tug, not in his arm, but in his memory. That was where I used to walk with someone. A time when the forest was still a refuge, not a prison. But that someone had forgotten him too, like everyone else. He screamed, but the forest didn't echo back. The sound died in the air, as if nature itself was tired of his cries. And then he fell to his knees, not out of weakness, but out of surrender. In that moment, he couldn't resist anymore. He stopped fighting the cold, the pain, the loneliness. He stopped pretending he was still what he'd left outside. He let himself be swallowed by the void. And it was there, with his face against the damp earth, that he felt something strange. Heat. Not from the sun, not from fire, but from within the soil, as if the earth were alive, as if there were something beneath their feet that still pulsed, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It wasn't comfort. It was revelation. The pain he felt wasn't punishment. It was excavation. The forest was digging something inside him, not to destroy him, but to expose what had been buried by fear. And when he opened his eyes, he saw footprints, fresh, big, deep, of wolf. There was no sound. There was no breath of wind, but something had passed by. And he knew, deep down, that he was no longer alone. The fog had enveloped the forest like a thick, dense, impenetrable curtain. Everything around him had disappeared. The trees, the sky, even the ground seemed uncertain. The world had dissolved into gray, as if time had stopped. And there, in that no place, he walked, directionless, weightless, just going. The fever still burned through his body, but his mind felt clearer than ever. It was as if, for the first time, he was seeing through the pain, not as an enemy, but as a mirror. The sounds were distorted, twigs snapping in impossible places, footsteps that weren't his own, muffled whispers that seemed to come from within the fog, or from within him. And then in the center of the mist, he saw, first, the eyes. Two amber dots, fixed, distant but unmistakable. There was no fear in them, only presence. Then, the silhouette emerged, slowly emerging from the dense white. It was a wolf, tall, imposing, silent. But it was no ordinary animal. There was something different, not in its body, but in its gaze. It was as if the creature carried memories, as if it knew exactly who he was, as if was himself in some form that he never had. The courage to accept. The wolf didn't come closer. He stood there, motionless, just staring. And in that gaze, he saw more than just a reflection of himself. He saw what could have been, what was denied, what was hidden beneath layers of guilt, fear, and silence. For a moment, he wanted to run away, but his feet wouldn't obey, and for the first time, he didn't run. He just looked back. Images began to appear around him, like memories projected into the mist. He saw his lost childhood, the moment of rejection, the lie he told to be accepted, the moment everything changed and he began to survive instead of live. The wolf then walked slowly around him, a circle, not of threat, but of protection, like a ritual. And when it stopped in front of him again, it let out a howl, low, deep, as if calling not to the forest, but something inside him. He fell to his knees once more, but this time, it wasn't weakness, it was clarity. The pain, the loss, the abandonment, It had all brought him here, and what he saw in the mist was what he refused to be. Not a beast, not a man, but both. The howling ceased. The wolf turned and disappeared into the dense white, but his image remained. Because that hadn't just been a vision, it was a call. And now, something had been awakened, something that could no longer be silenced. There was a moment, an instant so silent it seemed out of time, when he simply stopped. Not because he was tired, not because he had lost his way, but because for the first time, he felt no need to go forward or back. He stood in the middle of the clearing, his bare feet digging into the cold earth. The fog was beginning to lift, but the world was still quiet. The forest watched, as it always had. Only now, he wasn't afraid of it anymore. It was strange. All his life he'd run, from places, from people, from himself. He ran to fit in. He ran to forget. He ran to pretend what burned inside wasn't consuming him. But that morning, the silence weighed differently, not as absence, but as an answer. He looked around. Everything looked the same, but nothing was the same. The forest hadn't changed. He had. The cold didn't bother him. The pain in his body now seemed like a distant memory, and the loneliness was no longer a void, but a shelter. He wasn't alone. He never had been. He just couldn't see what had always been there, what he felt, what he refused, what he needed to face. He slowly sat down on the damp stone and closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. Icy air filled his lungs like fire, but this time, he didn't resist. He let it burn, because he knew that pain was purification. The tears came without warning, and for the first time, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of relief. As if by stopping running, he had found something lost long before the forest, long before his exile. His feet felt firmer, his hands less tense, his heart beating with a different rhythm. It wasn't courage that was born there, era true. He heard footsteps, slow, steady. He turned his eyes back to the trail. There was no one there, but he knew what was coming. It wasn't a threat, it was acceptance. At the edge of the clearing, the wolf appeared again, silent, majestic. But now the look was different. It wasn't judgmental, nor provocative. Era recognition. And when the wolf came closer and lay down a few feet away, he understood. A Floresta nunca quis punilo. She was waiting for him, and everything he went through was the path back to himself. The sun rose pale behind the trees, tinting the mist a faded gold. The forest, once oppressive, now breathed with it. It was as if everything there had been waiting for this moment, not the end of an escape, but the beginning of something ancient that was only now awakening. He stood alone in the center of the clearing, where the earth still bore the marks of what had been endured. Ahead of him, the wolf watched him silently. The same gaze, the same presence. But now there was something more, an understanding that needed no words. His body still ached, but it didn't matter. His mind still struggled to understand, but it didn't need to. Because there, in that moment, there was no room for doubt, only certainty. The forest burned him from the inside, so that he would stop carrying what was not his, so that the shell would collapse. And the instinct returned. He closed his eyes, his chest filled with an air that wasn't just breath. It was memory. It was roots. It was blood pulsing. Once again along an ancient path. And then he felt it. The first howl did not come from the mouth. It came from the chest. It came from everything that was repressed. It came from the times when he kept quiet about what he felt in order to be accepted. It came from the nights he slept afraid of who he was. It came from the boy who was forgotten, of the man they tried to mold, and the wolf who in silence waited for this day. It wasn't a loud sound. It was a whisper, internal, but powerful. It was the sound of acceptance, of transformation. When he opened his eyes, the wolf was no longer there. But it hadn't disappeared. Because now, it wasn't it. He walked along the trail as if returning to a familiar place. There was no more fog. There was no more uncertainty. The forest had burned him from the inside. But it was there, on that very ground, that here born as a wolf. And whoever looks carefully at the horizon, at the edge of the forest, might still see a solitary figure walking, alongside its own shadow. But it's not loneliness. It is freedom. You've heard the story. Now listen to what comes next. Subscribe to Shadows of the Packend. Discover what the forest still has to say. Because the next one to resurrect could be you.